3:17 in the morning. The kind of hour when the world feels suspended between yesterday and tomorrow, when even the streetlights seem to hum with uncertainty. I was pulled from sleep by the soft vibration of my phone against the nightstand, a sound that shouldn't have been there. Not at this hour, not when everyone I knew was supposed to be lost in their own dreams. The screen cast a pale blue glow across my face as I squinted at it. Noah. A single message, just 3 words that somehow carried more weight than they should have. You awake. I stared at those words for longer than I should have, my mind still thick with sleep, but my heart already quickening. Noah lived across the hall in our off-campus apartment complex, close enough that I could sometimes hear his television through the thin walls, close enough that this message felt more urgent than it had any right to be. We texted late sometimes, sure, but never like this. Never with the kind of hesitation I could feel even through the screen. I typed back a simple yes and waited. The response came immediately. Can you come over? There was something in those 4 words that made me sit up fully, sleep falling away like shed skin. No explanation, no casual joke to soften the request. Just a need, raw and unfiltered, reaching across the narrow hallway between our lives. I didn't bother with shoes. The hallway carpet was rough under my bare feet as I padded the short distance to his door, wearing nothing but a t-shirt and boxers, my hair still pressed flat on one side from my pillow. The knock I gave was soft, barely there, but he opened the door immediately, as if he'd been waiting just on the other side. Noah looked like he hadn't slept at all. His dark hair was mussed in a way that suggested restless tossing rather than peaceful sleep, and there were shadows under his eyes that hadn't been there when I'd seen him earlier that evening. He stepped aside to let me in without a word, and I followed him into the familiar space of his bedroom, a mirror image of my own, but somehow entirely different in the way it smelled like him, like the cologne he wore and something else I'd never been able to name. He sat on the edge of his bed, and I took the chair at his desk, spinning it to face him. The silence stretched between us, heavy with something I couldn't identify. Outside, a car passed on the street below, its headlights sweeping across the window and casting brief shadows on the wall before disappearing again into the night. I waited for him to explain, to laugh, and tell me he'd locked himself out of his own room, or couldn't find his phone charger, or any of the dozen small emergencies that might justify pulling your best friend from sleep at 3 in the morning. Instead, he looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before, something caught between confusion and fear, and something else that made my chest tighten. He opened his mouth once, closed it, ran a hand through his hair. When he finally spoke, his voice came out rough, like the words were scraping against his throat on their way out. I had a dream about you. The words hung in the air between us, simple and devastating. I felt my face change, felt a laugh bubble up in my chest as some automatic defense mechanism kicked in. Because what else do you do when your straight best friend tells you something like that? When the boy you've been quietly, desperately in love with for 3 years suddenly makes your heart stop with 5 words spoken in the dark. But when I started to laugh, to brush it off the way we'd brushed off 1,000 other awkward moments over the years, Noah shook his head. His eyes were serious, darker than I'd ever seen them, and there was something almost pleading in his expression. I can't stop thinking about it. The laugh died in my throat. This wasn't a joke, wasn't some casual confession meant to be forgotten by morning. This was Noah, my Noah, sitting on the edge of his bed at 3 in the morning, looking at me like I was both the problem and the solution to something he couldn't quite name. I felt the world tilt beneath me, as if the floor had become suddenly unreliable, as if the fundamental rules that governed our friendship had shifted without warning. We'd shared everything over the years, fears, hopes, the kind of secrets that only best friends know how to hold. But this felt different. This felt like standing at the edge of a cliff, looking down into something vast and unknowable. What kind of dream? The question was out of my mouth before I could stop it, before I could think about whether I really wanted to know the answer. My voice sounded strange to my own ears, too quiet, too careful. Noah's gaze dropped to his hands, folded in his lap. His fingers were long and elegant, the kind of hands that looked like they should be creating something beautiful rather than clenched with nervous tension. I watched him struggle with the words, Watched him fight some internal battle I wasn't privy to, the kind I shouldn't be having. His voice was barely above a whisper, but in the quiet of his room, it might as well have been shouted. The kind that made me wake up feeling like something had changed, like I was different somehow. I didn't know what to say to that. Didn't know how to respond to the tremor in his voice, or the way he was looking everywhere except at me. This was Noah, who dated half the girls in our high school, who talked about his hookups with the casual confidence of someone who'd never questioned what he wanted. This was Noah, who'd been my best friend since we were 17, who'd never given me any reason to hope for something more than friendship. And yet here he was, telling me about a dream that had left him sleepless and searching, a dream that had driven him to text me in the middle of the night like I was the only person in the world who might understand. I could feel my heart beating too fast, could feel the familiar ache that came with wanting something I couldn't have. But there was something else there too, something new and terrifying and fragile. Hope, maybe, or fear, or both twisted together until I couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. The silence stretched between us again, but it felt different now. Charged, like the air before a thunderstorm, heavy with the promise of something that would change everything. I watched Noah's chest rise and fall with careful breaths, watched the way his hands trembled almost imperceptibly in his lap. Outside, the world continued its slow turn toward dawn, but inside that small room, time felt suspended. We sat there in the space between words, between what had been said and what couldn't be taken back, two 20-something boys on the edge of something that might destroy everything or remake it entirely. I realized I was holding my breath, waiting for him to say more, waiting for him to explain what this meant, what he wanted from me. But Noah just sat there, looking lost and young and impossibly beautiful in the dim light filtering through his window, and I knew that whatever came next, we'd already crossed a line we couldn't uncross. The moment hung between us like a question neither of us was ready to answer, but that demanded an answer nonetheless. And in the quiet of that suspended moment, I felt something fundamental shift inside me, something that had been locked away for years suddenly stirring to life, dangerous and desperate and completely beyond my control. Noah and I had been inevitable since the first day of senior year English, when Mrs. Henderson assigned us as partners for a project on contemporary poetry. I remember watching him slouch into the desk beside mine, all easy confidence and careless charm, his backpack hitting the floor with a thud that seemed to announce his presence to the entire room. He was everything I wasn't: loud, where I was quiet; magnetic, where I was invisible, the kind of person who drew others into his orbit without even trying. I was the one who stayed up until 3 a.m. crafting our presentation, who found the perfect poems to analyze, who typed up our notes in careful, color-coded sections. Noah was the one who stood in front of the class and delivered all with such natural charisma that everyone forgot I existed. But afterward, when we were walking out of the classroom, he grabbed my arm and said something that changed everything. That was brilliant. I couldn't have done any of that without you. The sincerity in his voice caught me off guard. Most people saw Noah as all surface, all easy smiles and casual jokes, but there was something deeper there, something genuine that he only lets certain people see. For reasons I still don't entirely understand, I became one of those people. We were opposites in every way that seemed to matter. He was studying business with the kind of confidence that suggested he'd never doubted his place in the world. I was an English major, the kind who carried worn paperbacks in my back pocket and spent Friday nights in the library stacks instead of at parties. Noah collected people like souvenirs, filling every room he entered with laughter and noise. I preferred the quiet corners, the spaces where I could think and breathe and exist without performance. But somehow, impossibly, we fit together. Our friendship became the kind of thing that defied explanation. Two people who shouldn't have worked, but did, who found in each other something that made sense of all the ways that didn't make sense to anyone else. Our lives began to orbit around each other with a naturalness that surprised everyone, including us. Shared meals became routine, our schedules bending around each other without conscious decision. Movie nights stretched into the early hours of morning, both of us curled on opposite ends of his couch, arguing about plot holes, or laughing at inside jokes that no one else would understand. When the loneliness got too heavy, the particular weight that comes with being 21 and still figuring out who you're supposed to become, we'd end up falling asleep in the same room, one of us on the bed and the other on the floor, as if proximity alone could ward off the uncertainty. To everyone else, we were just best friends. The kind of friendship that people admired but didn't question, that seemed both enviable and perfectly ordinary. Noah's girlfriends would smile when they met me, treating me like a harmless fixture in his life, someone safe and unthreatening. His casual hookups became stories he'd tell me afterward, sprawled across my bed while I pretended to study, describing kisses and touches and moments of connection that left me aching with a longing I could never name. I became an expert at disguising what I felt for him. Every flutter of attraction got reframed as loyalty. Every moment of jealousy became protective concern. When he dated Sarah for 3 months junior year, I told myself the knot in my stomach was just worry that she wasn't good enough for him. When he hooked up with Jessica after the homecoming dance, I convinced myself that my sleepless night was just insomnia, not the image of his hands on someone else's skin playing on endless repeat in my mind. I built an entire architecture of denial around my feelings, a careful structure of friendship and devotion that kept the truth locked safely away. I never let myself imagine it could be mutual. Noah was straight, confidently and casually straight, the kind of person who moved through the world without questioning what he wanted because what he wanted had always been readily available to him. But something had shifted that night he told me about the dream. In the days that followed, I caught him looking at me differently, as if he was seeing me through new eyes. There'd be moments of silence that felt charged, conversations that seemed to carry double meanings. He started sitting closer during our movie nights, his shoulder pressed against mine in a way that felt deliberate. When he laughed at something I said, his hand would linger on my arm a beat longer than necessary. I told myself I was imagining things, that I was projecting my own desperate hopes onto innocent gestures. But there was something restless in Noah now, something unsettled that hadn't been there before. He'd catch me watching him and hold my gaze a moment too long, his expression unreadable. He'd bring up the dream in passing, joking about it, brushing it off, but there was an intensity underneath the casual words that felt less like teasing and more like testing. For the first time in our friendship, I wasn't just his safe place, his reliable constant. I had become the subject of something he couldn't dismiss, couldn't categorize, couldn't file away under the familiar headings that had always made sense of his world. And that shift, subtle as it was, changed everything between us, even when we were both too afraid to acknowledge it. The dream became Noah's returning ghost, haunting conversations when I least expected it. At first, he'd bring it up with the forced casualness of someone trying to convince himself it didn't matter. We'd be walking to class, discussing some mundane assignment, and suddenly he'd say something like, that dream I told you about? It was probably just stress or something. Too much caffeine before bed. But his voice would catch on the words, betraying the careful indifference he was trying to project. I learned to recognize the signs when it was coming back to him. His fingers would drum against his thigh, a restless rhythm that meant his mind was elsewhere. He'd go quiet in the middle of conversations, staring at nothing with an expression I'd never seen before, something caught between confusion and hunger. When I'd ask what he was thinking about, he'd shake his head and change the subject, but I could feel the weight of unspoken words hanging between us. The casual mentions became less casual. One evening, as we sat in his room, supposedly studying, but mostly just existing in each other's space, he closed his textbook with more force than necessary and looked at me with an intensity that made my breath catch. It felt so real, he said, his voice dropping to something barely above a whisper. Like I could feel you. Like I could feel everything. The air in the room seemed to thicken around us. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears, could feel heat creeping up my neck despite the cool October air drifting through his open window. I tried to laugh it off, to defuse the moment with humor the way we'd always done when things got too serious. But the sound came out strange and hollow. No one noticed. He always noticed everything about me, had been cataloging my reactions and expressions for years with the kind of attention that I'd mistaken for friendship. But now, there was something predatory in the way he watched me, something calculating that made me feel exposed and vulnerable in ways I'd never experienced. That's when he started testing boundaries. It began with small things, gestures that could be explained away as natural intimacy between best friends. He'd sit closer during our movie nights, close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from his skin, close enough that when he laughed, his shoulder would bump against mine with deliberate pressure. His hand would find reasons to touch me, adjusting my collar when it was already straight, brushing imaginary lint from my sleeve, letting his fingers linger on my arm when he was making a point in conversation. Each touch sent electricity through my system, but I forced myself to remain still, to not react in ways that might give away what I'd been hiding for years. I told myself he was just being Noah, just being the naturally tactile person he'd always been. But there was something different now, something purposeful in the way he moved around me, as if he was conducting some kind of experiment, and I was his unwitting subject. The eye contact became unbearable. Where before Noah had looked at me with the easy familiarity of long friendship, now his gaze would catch mine and hold it until I felt like I was drowning. There was a question in those moments, something he was trying to communicate without words, and I found myself both desperate to understand and terrified of what the answer might mean. I started making excuses to leave earlier, to cut our time together short before the tension became too much to bear. But Noah seemed to sense my retreat and responded by drawing closer, by finding new ways to occupy the same space. He'd show up at my door with coffee and a smile, inviting himself in for study sessions that had nothing to do with studying. He'd text me at random hours with questions that could have waited, with observations about his day that felt more like reaching out than sharing. The breaking point came on a Thursday night in late October. There'd been a party in the building, someone's birthday celebration that had spilled out into the hallway and left our floor smelling like cheap beer and too much cologne. We'd avoided it, choosing instead to order pizza and watch some mindless action movie in Noah's room. But the party had left us both slightly drunk on the energy of other people's revelry, loose-limbed and unguarded in ways we rarely allowed ourselves to be. The movie was forgotten, running on in the background while we talked about nothing and everything. Noah was lying on his bed. I was sprawled on the floor beside it, both of us staring at the ceiling as if it held answers to questions we couldn't voice. The conversation had drifted into that comfortable territory of shared silence when Noah's voice cut through the quiet, soft and uncertain and completely devastating. I can't stop wondering what it would actually feel like. I turned to look at him, my heart hammering against my ribs. He was already watching me, his expression open and vulnerable in a way that made my chest ache. The question in his eyes was unmistakable now, no longer hidden behind casual touches and meaningful glances. "If you let me try." The words hung in the air between us like a bridge neither of us could cross alone. I could see him waiting for my response, could see the fear and hope warring in his expression. This was the moment we'd been building toward since that first night he'd told me about the dream, the culmination of weeks of testing and watching and wondering. And I realized with a clarity that was both terrifying and inevitable that I was going to say yes. The word yes left my lips like a confession, barely audible above the sound of my own pulse thundering in my ears. Noah's eyes widened slightly, as if he hadn't expected me to actually answer, as if he'd been prepared for rejection or laughter or anything except the quiet surrender in my voice. For a moment, neither of us moved. The space between the bed and the floor where I lay suddenly felt vast and impossible to cross, charged with the weight of what we were about to do. Then Noah shifted, sliding down from the bed to sit beside me on the carpet, close enough that I could see the nervous flutter of his pulse at the base of his throat. His hand found mine first, fingers intertwining with a tentative pressure that felt both foreign and familiar. We'd touched countless times over the years, casual contact, friendly embraces, but this was different. This carried intention, purpose, the acknowledgement that we were stepping across a line we'd drawn between us without ever discussing its existence. When he leaned toward me, I could smell the faint scent of his shampoo, could see the way his eyelashes cast shadows on his cheekbones in the dim light from his desk lamp. The kiss, when it came, was hesitant and clumsy and perfect in its imperfection. His lips were softer than I'd imagined, warmer than I'd allowed myself to dream, and for a moment I forgot how to breathe. It lasted only seconds, but those seconds stretched into something infinite. When we pulled apart, Noah's eyes were wide with surprise, as if he'd discovered something unexpected about himself in the simple act of pressing his mouth to mine. There was wonder there, and confusion, and something deeper that I didn't dare name. That was, he started, then stopped, his voice catching on words he couldn't seem to find. His hand was still in mine, his thumb tracing absent patterns across my knuckles. Different, better than the dream. The admission hung between us like a secret we were both afraid to keep and afraid to share. I could see him processing what had just happened, could watch his mind working through the implications of what this meant for us, for our friendship, for everything we'd built together over the years. But before I could respond, before I could find words to match the enormity of the moment, Noah was leaning toward me again. This time the kiss was less hesitant, more deliberate, his free hand coming up to cup my face with a gentleness that made my chest ache. I kissed him back with years of suppressed longing, pouring everything I'd never been able to say into the contact between us. That's how it began, with tentative exploration that gradually gave way to something hungrier, more desperate. We stayed on that floor for what felt like hours, learning the geography of each other's mouths, discovering that the reality of touch was more intoxicating than any fantasy I constructed in my careful solitude. But even in those first moments, I could sense the conflict in Noah, the way he'd pull back periodically to study my face as if searching for answers to questions he hadn't learned to ask yet. He'd touch my cheek, trace the line of my jaw, then pause with an expression that suggested he was trying to reconcile what he was feeling with everything he'd thought he knew about himself. Just to compare, he said after our third kiss, the words coming out rushed and defensive. I just need to understand what it means. I nodded, even though the excuse felt hollow to both of us. We were already past the point where this could be explained away as simple curiosity, already too deep in the current to pretend we were just testing the waters. But if Noah needed the fiction to continue, I was willing to play along. I've been pretending about my feelings for years. What was a little more pretense if it meant I could have this? The pattern established itself over the following days. Noah would find reasons for us to be alone together, would initiate contact with the same careful casualness he'd once used to mention the dream. A hand on my shoulder that lingered too long. A goodbye that turned into an embrace that turned into something deeper. Moments of connection that he'd frame afterward as experiments, as attempts to understand something that didn't make sense to him. Our friendship began to blur at the edges, becoming something indefinable and dangerous. Movie nights transformed into opportunities for proximity, for the kind of casual intimacy that felt anything but casual. We'd start on opposite ends of the couch and end up tangled together, my head on his shoulder or his legs stretched across my lap, both of us pretending the contact was accidental even as we sought it out with increasing desperation. The conversations afterward were the hardest part. Noah would lie beside me in the dark, staring at the ceiling with an expression of such profound confusion that I wanted to gather him in my arms and promise him that everything would be okay. But I didn't know if it would be okay. I didn't know what we were doing or where it would lead or whether we were building something beautiful or destroying something precious. In those quiet moments, when the heat of kissing had faded and left us both raw and uncertain, I could see him searching for answers in the shadows above us. His breathing would be careful and measured, as if he was afraid that too much oxygen might clarify thoughts he wasn't ready to have. Sometimes he'd reach for me in the darkness, his hand finding mine with the desperation of someone trying to anchor himself to something solid. I began to understand that this was as confusing for him as it was intoxicating for me. Every touch, every kiss, every moment of connection was reshaping his understanding of himself in ways that both thrilled and terrified him. And I was both witness and catalyst to that transformation, watching him discover parts of himself he'd never known existed while trying to navigate my own feelings of hope and fear and desperate, dangerous love. The revelation came on a Tuesday night in November when the first real cold snap had settled over campus and the heating in our building was struggling to keep up. We've been existing in this strange liminal space for weeks now, caught between friendship and something deeper, between what we'd always been and what we were becoming. The pattern had become familiar: stolen moments, careful touches, kisses that left us both breathless and confused. But something was different that night. There was a restlessness in Noah that went beyond his usual post-kiss uncertainty, a tension that seemed to vibrate through his entire body as we lay on his bed afterward. The space between us both vast and non-existent. We'd been kissing for what felt like hours, losing ourselves in the heat and proximity until the world outside his room had ceased to exist entirely. When we finally broke apart, Noah didn't retreat to his usual contemplative silence. Instead, he stayed close, his forehead pressed against mine, our breath mingling in the small space between us. I could feel the rapid flutter of his pulse where my hand rested against his chest, could see something working behind his eyes in the dim light filtering through his blinds. His voice, when it came, was shakier than I'd ever heard it. Raw with something that sounded like fear and wonder and desperate honesty all tangled together. It's not just a dream anymore. The words hit me like a physical blow, stealing the air from my lungs. I'd grown accustomed to his explanations, his careful frameworks that allowed us to continue without naming what we were doing. The dream had become our safe excuse, the thing we could blame for the way his hands lingered on my skin, for the way my name sounded different when he whispered it in the dark. But now he was telling me something else entirely, something that made my heart hammer against my ribs with a mixture of hope and terror. I think about you when I'm awake too. The admission seemed to surprise him as much as it devastated me. His eyes went wide, as if he hadn't meant to speak the words aloud, as if they'd escaped from some carefully guarded place inside him without his permission. But there they were, hanging in the air between us like a bridge we could either cross or burn. I felt my chest tighten with the weight of everything I'd been carrying for years, all the careful secrets I'd built my life around suddenly pressing against my throat like a confession that demanded to be spoken. This was the moment I'd dreamed of and dreaded in equal measure, the moment when pretense might finally give way to truth. Noah, I started, but he shook his head, his hand coming up to trace the line of my jaw with trembling fingers. Let me finish, he whispered. Please, I need to say this. So I stayed quiet and let him find his words, even though the silence felt like holding my breath underwater. His thumb brushed across my cheekbone, and I could see him gathering courage for whatever came next. I think about you during classes, during conversations with other people, when I'm supposed to be sleeping, when I'm supposed to be thinking about anything else. You're just there in my head like you've always been there, but now it's different. Now it's not just friendship, it's not just comfort. It's want and need, and something I don't know how to name. Each word felt like a small miracle, like pieces of a puzzle I'd been trying to solve for years finally clicking into place. But beneath the joy was terror, the fear that this moment was too fragile to sustain, that morning would come and bring with it all the reasons why this couldn't work, why we couldn't be what we seemed to be becoming. The silence that followed was heavy with possibility and danger. I could feel Noah waiting for me to respond, could see the vulnerability in his expression, the way he'd opened himself up completely and was now waiting to see if I would do the same or retreat into the safety of our old patterns. But I was tired of safety, tired of pretending, tired of loving him in careful silence while he discovered feelings that I'd been carrying like a secret weight for longer than I could remember. I've thought about you for years, I said, my voice barely above a whisper, but carrying the full weight of everything I'd never been able to tell him. Not just sometimes, not just when I'm confused or curious. Always. Since the first day we became friends, since the first time you fell asleep on my couch, since every moment we've shared when I had to pretend that what I felt was just friendship. The words tumbled out of me like water through a broken dam. Years of careful control finally giving way to honesty that felt both terrifying and inevitable. I watched Noah's face change as he absorbed what I was telling him, watched understanding dawn in his eyes along with something that looked like relief. "You mean," he started, then stopped, his voice catching on the implications. "I mean, I've been in love with you since I was 18 years old. And every kiss we've shared has been both everything I've ever wanted and a reminder of everything I thought I could never have." The confession hung between us like a living thing, beautiful and dangerous and impossible to take back. I could see Noah processing it, could watch him reorganize everything he thought he knew about our friendship, about the way I looked at him, about the careful distance I'd maintained even in our closest moments. The silence that followed felt endless, charged with the weight of truth finally spoken. I had laid myself bare, had given him everything I'd been guarding so carefully, and now there was nothing left to do but wait and see if this honesty would save us or destroy everything we'd built together. When Noah finally moved, it was to close the remaining distance between us, his mouth finding mine with a desperate intensity that felt like an answer to every question I'd been afraid to ask. And in that kiss, I tasted something new, not curiosity or confusion, but recognition. The acknowledgement that what we'd been circling around for weeks had a name, had weight, had a future that neither of us could predict, but both of us suddenly seemed willing to discover. The morning after our confessions brought a cold that seemed to seep through the walls and settle in my bones. I woke alone in my own bed, the memory of Noah's kiss still burning on my lips, but the space beside me empty and somehow accusatory. The truth we'd spoken in the dark felt different in daylight, more fragile, more dangerous, weighted with implications that neither of us had been prepared to face. Noah avoided me for 3 days. It wasn't obvious at first. A missed text here, a class he suddenly couldn't walk to together there. But by the second day, the pattern was unmistakable. The boy who had spent weeks seeking out my company, who had found excuses to touch me and reasons to be close, had retreated so completely that our shared hallway felt like an ocean between us. I found myself listening for sound from his room with an intensity that bordered on obsession. The murmur of his television, the closing of his door, footsteps in the hallway that might or might not be his. Every ordinary sound became loaded with meaning, evidence of a life continuing just beyond my reach while I sat in my own room, wondering if I'd destroyed the most important relationship I'd ever had. The apartment felt different without his presence filling it. Colder, emptier. The silence that had once been comfortable now felt oppressive, heavy with all the things we'd said and couldn't take back. I caught myself reaching for my phone to text him a dozen times a day, then stopping, paralyzed by the fear that any contact from me would only push him further away. By Thursday, I was convinced I'd lost him entirely. The weight of that possibility sat on my chest like a stone, making it difficult to breathe, impossible to focus on anything else. I'd been so careful for so long, had guarded my feelings so meticulously, and in one moment of honesty, I'd thrown it all away. I was lying on my bed, staring at the ceiling, and trying to convince myself that friendship without him was still better than no relationship at all, when I heard the soft knock on my door. My heart stopped, then began beating so fast I felt lightheaded. I knew that knock, knew the particular rhythm of his knuckles against wood. When I opened the door, Noah looked terrible. His hair was disheveled. There were dark circles under his eyes, and he was wearing the same shirt I'd seen him in 2 days earlier. But it was his expression that undid me, raw and vulnerable and desperate in a way I'd never seen before. We stared at each other for a long moment, neither of us sure how to begin. The hallway around us was quiet, but I could feel the weight of our silence filling the space between our doors like a living thing. "I don't want to pretend anymore," he said finally, his voice rough as if he'd been screaming or crying or both. His hands were shaking, I noticed, clenched into fists at his sides. "I don't want to lose you, but I can't keep acting like it didn't happen." The words hit me like a physical blow, relief and fear warring in my chest. He looked so young standing there, so uncertain and brave and completely undone by the magnitude of what we were facing together. "Then stop pretending," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, but carrying every ounce of courage I could muster. The words felt like jumping off a cliff, like choosing to fall rather than remain, suspended in uncertainty forever. Something shifted in Noah's expression, surprise giving way to something that looked almost like hope. He stepped forward, crossing the threshold into my room without invitation, and suddenly the space between us collapsed entirely. This kiss was different from all the others. There was no hesitation, no careful testing of boundaries or gentle exploration. This was desperation and hunger, and the kind of honesty that could only come after days of forced separation. He kissed me like he was trying to make up for lost time, like he was afraid I might disappear if he didn't hold on tight enough. When we finally broke apart, both breathing hard, he pressed his forehead against mine with an intimacy that felt more profound than any of the physical contact we'd shared before. I was scared, he whispered, the admission coming out in a rush. I was scared of what it meant, what people would think, what it would do to us. But these past few days without you, that was worse than being scared. That was like trying to breathe underwater. I understood what he meant. The fear was still there, would probably always be there to some degree. The questions about our future, about how we navigate a world that might not understand what we were becoming, about whether we could survive the transition from friendship to something deeper and more complex. But the alternative, living without each other, pretending that what we felt wasn't real, had proven impossible. "I'm scared too," I told him, my hands finding their way to his face, tracing the familiar lines I'd memorized over years of careful observation. "But I'm more scared of losing you than I am of figuring out what this means." He nodded against my touch, his eyes closing as if in relief. When he opened them again, there was something settled there, something decided that hadn't been there before. "No more excuses," he said, and it sounded like a promise. "No more pretending it's just curiosity or confusion or anything other than what it actually is." "What is it actually?" I asked, though I thought I knew the answer, had been carrying it in my chest for years. "Love," he said simply, the word falling from his lips like it had been waiting there all along. Complicated, terrifying, impossible love that doesn't make sense to anyone including us, but is real anyway. The word hung between us like a benediction, like the final piece of a puzzle we'd been solving without realizing it. And in that moment, standing in my doorway with his hands in my hair and truth finally spoken between us, I knew we'd made our choice. Not between friendship and romance, but between fear and the terrifying, beautiful possibility of becoming something neither of us had ever imagined we could be. The morning comes slowly, filtered through the blinds and golden bars that paint patterns across our skin. I wake to the weight of Noah's arm across my chest, to the steady rhythm of his breathing against my shoulder, to the impossible reality that he's here, that this is real, that we've somehow survived the night and emerged into something entirely new. The coffee mugs on my nightstand have long since gone cold, forgotten casualties of conversations that stretched deep into the darkness. We'd talked until exhaustion finally claimed us, voices growing softer as we mapped the territory of this new thing we'd become. Not just lovers, not quite the same friends we'd been before, but something unprecedented that belonged only to us. Noah stirs against me, a small sound escaping his throat as consciousness slowly returns. His fingers flex against my ribs, and I feel him testing the boundaries of wakefulness, determining whether this is dream or reality. When he lifts his head to look at me, his hair is pressed flat on one side, and there's a crease from my pillowcase running along his cheek. He's beautiful in the morning light, softer somehow than he appears in the harsh fluorescence of classrooms or the artificial warmth of dorm lighting. This is Noah unguarded, Noah without performance or careful presentation. This is the version of him that I get to keep, that belongs to me in ways I'm still learning to believe. For a moment, we just look at each other, both of us perhaps expecting the awkwardness that should come with morning, with sobriety, with the harsh clarity that daylight brings to decisions made in darkness. But there's no regret in his expression, no retreat from what we've acknowledged between us. Instead, there's wonder, the kind of quiet amazement that comes with discovering something precious you'd forgotten you were searching for. Hey, he says, his voice rough with sleep, but steady in ways that matter. Hey, yourself, I respond, and we both smile at the ordinariness of it, the way the world hasn't ended just because we've rewritten the fundamental rules of our relationship. He shifts closer, resting his head back on my shoulder, and I feel him relax into me with a completeness that speaks of decisions made and accepted. Outside, the campus is beginning to wake. Distant voices, the slam of doors, the everyday sounds of other people beginning other days. But inside this room, we exist in a pocket of stillness that feels separate from all of that, protected and precious and entirely our own. I think about the boy I was just months ago, the one who harbored secret feelings and careful longings, who built elaborate architectures of denial around what he wanted most. That version of me seems impossibly distant now, like a character from someone else's story. The ache that had lived in my chest for years, the constant low-grade pain of wanting what I couldn't have, has been replaced by something warmer, more sustainable. Not the desperate hunger of unrequited love, but the steady glow of something mutual, something chosen, something real. Noah traces lazy patterns on my chest with his fingertip, and I can feel him thinking, processing, perhaps marveling at the strangeness of finding ourselves here. We've been best friends for years, had thought we knew everything about each other, but this intimacy reveals new territories neither of us had mapped before. The way he curls into me, the soft sound he makes when I run my fingers through his hair, the particular rhythm of his breathing when he's content. These are discoveries, gifts that come with crossing the line we'd drawn between us. I was thinking, he says after a while, his voice muffled against my skin, about that first night. When I told you about the dream, I remember the uncertainty in his voice that night, the way he'd sat on the edge of his bed like he was poised for flight. It seems impossible now that we'd been so afraid of what we were feeling that we'd spent weeks circling around something that feels as natural as breathing. What about it? I ask, though I think I know where this is heading. I don't think it was really about the dream at all. I think I just needed an excuse to tell you something I'd been feeling but didn't know how to name. The honesty in his admission makes my chest tight with affection. This is what love looks like, I think. Not just the dramatic declarations or passionate kisses, but these quiet moments of recognition, these small acts of emotional bravery that build trust one truth at a time. Maybe the dream was just your subconscious finally catching up with what you already knew, I suggest, and feel him nod against my shoulder. The dream was nothing compared to this, he murmurs, echoing words he'd spoken in darkness, but that somehow carry more weight in the morning light. Reality is better. You're better. I don't know what the future holds for us. I don't know how we'll navigate the complexity of being what we are in a world that might not understand. I don't know if what we feel now will survive the pressures of expectation and doubt and all the ordinary challenges that test even the strongest connections. But I know this, Noah choosing to stay, choosing to wake up beside me, rather than retreating to the safety of separate beds and careful distance, feels like the beginning of something worth whatever challenges might come. We've crossed the bridge between friendship and love, and there's no going back. But looking at him now, feeling the solid warmth of him against me, I don't want to go back. This is enough. This moment, this choice, this quiet morning that belongs entirely to us. Whatever comes next, we'll face it together, no longer pretending to be anything other than what we are, two people who found love in the last place they expected to look, who chose courage over comfort, who built something beautiful from friendship and longing and the brave decision to stop pretending. The sun climbs higher, and eventually we'll have to leave this bed, return to the world of classes and obligations, and the thousand small performances that daily life requires. But for now, we exist in this suspended moment, this pocket of peace where everything is exactly as it should be.